Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. In the weeks that followed the hospital's mysterious pause, life settled into the gentle rhythms of the lighthouse keeper's cottage, where Iris would spend her first years learning that time could be as fluid as the tides that kissed the rocky shore below. The drive home from the hospital had taken them along the dark ribbon of coastal road, past sleeping fishing villages and weathered piers, until the lighthouse rose before them like a patient finger pointing toward the stars. Its beacon swept the darkness in steady intervals. Count, sweep, count, a mechanical heartbeat that would become the soundtrack to Iris's childhood. The cottage itself was small but luminous, painted white with shutters the color of sea glass, nestled against the lighthouse's base like a child seeking shelter beside its parent. Samuel, Iris's father, had been keeper there for nearly 2 decades, long enough to understand that the ocean kept its own time, sometimes rushing forward in violent storms, sometimes pausing in glassy calms that stretched for hours without a single wave breaking against the rocks below. He carried an old brass pocket watch that had belonged to his grandfather, its steady tick-tock, a quiet counterpoint to the rhythmic conversation between wind and water. Eleanor, her mother, had painted the interior walls a soft blue-green that caught the changing light throughout the day, and she'd hung crystals in the windows that threw tiny rainbows across the floors when the afternoon sun hit them just right. It was in this gentle, light-filled space that Iris learned to walk, to speak, and to notice the peculiar way moments seemed to stretch like warm taffy when something beautiful was happening. Her first conscious memory lived in one of those bright pools of awareness, a Tuesday morning when she was 4, sitting in her high chair with sticky fingers wrapped around a piece of pancake, while Elena hummed a Spanish lullaby her own mother had sung to her. The kitchen smelled of vanilla and butter, and outside the window, a pair of gulls rode the morning thermals with barely a wing beat. Soaring in lazy circles above the waves, Samuel was reading the weather report aloud from his crackling radio when Iris noticed something extraordinary. Her mother's humming seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, each note lingering like honey poured from a spoon. She looked around the kitchen with the intense focus that only small children possess, and realized that everything had acquired a dreamlike quality. The steam rising from her father's coffee cup spiraled upward in perfect, unhurried coils. A drop of maple syrup that had been falling from her piece of pancake hung suspended halfway to her plate, catching the morning light like an amber jewel. Even the dust motes dancing in the sunbeam moved with the slow grace of underwater ballet. But it wasn't frightening, this gentle pause in the world's clockwork. Instead, it felt like being wrapped in the softest blanket imaginable, like being held in the palm of time itself. Iris giggled, a sound that seemed to ripple outward in golden waves, and as if responding to her delight, the moment gradually resumed its normal pace. The syrup completed its journey to her plate. Her mother's lullaby continued its familiar melody, and her father turned the page of his newspaper with the soft rustle of ordinary time. Elena noticed first, the way mothers always do when something shifts in their child's world. She paused in her pancake flipping and looked at Iris with those dark eyes that missed nothing. "Mi niña," she said softly, "what are you smiling about?" But Iris was 4, and 4-year-olds don't have words for miracles. She just pointed at the sunbeam and said, "Pretty dancing," which made Elena smile and kiss the top of her curly head. As the seasons turned, these gentle temporal anomalies became as much a part of their household rhythm as the lighthouse beacon's steady sweep across the dark water each night. When a jar of seashells tumbled from the windowsill, knocked by the cottage cat's curious paw, it would pause mid-fall just long enough for Elena's hands to catch it safely. When storms rolled in from the Atlantic, the thunder seemed to pull its punches around the cottage, as if reluctant to wake a baby who slept with her hand curled around a loose thread in her blanket. The most remarkable occurrence happened on a foggy evening in late September, when Iris's grandmother came to visit from the mainland. Abuela Rosa was Elena's mother, a woman who had raised 7 children and buried a husband, whose hands were maps of hard work and whose laugh was like silver bells in a gentle breeze. She brought homemade flan and stories from the old country, and after dinner, the 4 of them sat around the kitchen table while Rosa told tales of her childhood in a fishing village where church bells could be heard across the water on clear mornings. Iris was curled in her father's lap, drowsy from the warm milk and honey Elena had given her. When Rosa began to laugh at something Samuel had said about the seagulls stealing his lunch, it was the kind of laugh that bubbles up from deep in the chest, pure and unself-conscious, and as it filled the small kitchen, Iris felt that familiar sensation of the world growing soft around the edges. But this time was different. This time Rosa's laughter didn't just hang in the air, it seemed to multiply, echoing and harmonizing with itself until the kitchen was filled with layers of joy. Each note of her grandmother's mirth creating ripples of warmth that touched every corner of the room. The sound lifted and held, floating like a blessing above the dinner table. Samuel found himself chuckling along, then Elena joined in, and soon all four of them were laughing together in a moment that felt both eternal and perfectly natural. When the laughter finally faded, Rosa wiped tears from her eyes and said, I haven't laughed like that since your grandfather was alive. It felt like he was here with us, laughing too. She reached over and touched Iris's cheek with her weathered hand. This little one, she has something special about her. I can feel it. Elena and Samuel exchanged a glance over their daughter's head. They had both noticed the strange little pauses, the way time seemed to pool around Iris like water finding its level, but neither had spoken of it aloud. It seemed too fragile a thing to name, too precious to examine too closely. But Rosa's words gave them permission to acknowledge what they had been sensing, that their daughter existed in a slightly different relationship with time than the rest of the world, and that this gift, whatever it was, seemed to bring only beauty and peace to the moments it touched. That night, after Rosa had gone to bed in the small guest room, Eleanor sat in the rocking chair by Iris's crib, watching her daughter sleep. The lighthouse beams swept across the window every 30 seconds, painting moving shadows on the nursery walls. And Elena found herself thinking about time, how it rushes when you want it to slow, how it crawls when you're waiting for something wonderful, how it seems to stop altogether when you're holding your sleeping child and trying to memorize the weight of their small body against your chest. She began to hum, the same Spanish lullaby she'd been singing that morning at breakfast, and as the melody drifted through the room, she could swear she felt the lighthouse beam pause just slightly as it passed over the window, as if even the mechanical rhythm of the beacon wanted to linger in this moment of perfect tenderness. Outside, the waves continued their ancient conversation with the shore, but they seemed to whisper more softly, as if they too understood that some moments deserved to be held with extra care. In her crib, Iris stirred slightly and smiled in her sleep, and for just a heartbeat, maybe 13 heartbeats, the entire lighthouse seemed to breathe in unison, keeper and kept light and darkness, time and the gentle soul who was learning to tend it with love. The memory of that lingering laughter had become a soft motif in her young mind, a secret melody that hinted at the deeper rhythms of time she was beginning to perceive, a quiet promise that some moments were simply too beautiful to let slip away unnoticed, too precious not to be held, if only for just a little while longer. As Iris grew from toddler to child, she learned the lighthouse's lessons without knowing she was learning them at all. Her father would carry her up the spiral stairs when her legs were too short to climb, and later walk behind her with his hands open but not touching, letting her find her own courage. Up in the lantern room, the air tasted like salt and iron, and the great lens held the day like a glass cup holds water. Each time the beam swept past, Iris felt a sensation like a soft brush across her skin, as if someone was smoothing hair from a forehead, not a voice exactly, but a tension made light. "This is not our light," Samuel told her one evening, as he showed her how to polish the lens. "We keep it. That's all. So it can do what it was made to do." The words slid into Iris and found a place to live, settling beside the memory of her grandmother's laughter and the feeling of syrup suspended in golden light. "Not our light, we keep it." She looked at the lantern, which burned with steady certainty, and felt the smallest kinship, understanding without words that she too might be a keeper of something precious, something that needed tending with gentle hands and patient heart. There were, of course, ordinary days ruled by laundry and scraped knees, by the taste of tomato soup and the sound of rain against the windows. But even those felt a shade deeper somehow, as if time in that lighthouse cottage wore a softer sweater, moved at the speed of tides rather than clocks. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the fog rolled in thick as wool and the horn sounded its patient warning across the water, Iris would sit with a mug of tea she wasn't quite old enough to drink and listen to the steady argument the world makes for staying alive, feeling in her chest the quiet certainty that whatever this gift was, it would ask more of her someday. For now, she was content to be its favorite student, learning the art of holding moments lightly, like glass spheres that showed, if you tilted them just right, a clear and wondrous world. By the time Iris could climb the lighthouse stairs without help, counting each of the 43 steps that spiraled upward like a prayer made of iron and stone, she had begun to understand that her father's work was less about machinery and more about patience. Samuel would wake her before dawn on the clearest mornings, when the air tasted of salt and possibility, wrapping her in his thick wool coat that smelled of pipe tobacco and the honest work of keeping light alive in darkness. Together they would climb to the lantern room, where the great Fresnel lens waited like a sleeping eye, ready to gather the first threads of sunrise and weave them into something ships could follow home. "See how the light doesn't hurry?" Samuel would whisper, his weathered hand resting gently on her shoulder as they watched the horizon blush from deep purple to rose. "It knows it has all the time in the world to reach us." Iris would press her face against the curved glass, watching the dawn paint the ocean in colors that had no names, and feel something stirring in her chest, a gentle pulling sensation, as if her heartbeat wanted to slow down and match the patient rhythm of the morning. The lighthouse beam, even in daylight, seemed to acknowledge her presence with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with recognition. Her father taught her the keeper's true vocabulary: gallery, lens, service room, the stairs that sang different songs depending on whether the wind came from the north or the east. But more than the names of things, he taught her their purpose. "This is not our light," he would say as they polished the great lens together, her small cloth moving in careful circles beside his practiced hands. "We keep it, that's all, so it can do what it was made to do." The words settled into Iris like seeds finding good soil, growing into an understanding that would shape everything she became. Some mornings, when fog hugged the cliff and the horn spaced its low calls with the patience of someone who has all night to wait, Iris would feel the lighthouse beam tug at her attention like a gentle hand on her sleeve. It was subtle at first, a fishing boat moving carefully through the mist, its running lights barely visible against the grey water. Without thinking, without even understanding what she was doing, Iris would soften her breathing and watch the beam seem to linger just a heartbeat longer over that uncertain stretch of water, giving the captain time to read the currents, to feel his way safely past the rocky shallows that had claimed less fortunate vessels in years past. Samuel noticed these moments in the way practical men notice good fortune, by the outcomes that arranged themselves like gifts. "Lucky morning," he would say, watching a lobster boat clear the dangerous rocks and find open water. He would glance at his pocket watch, which showed nothing unusual, and place a warm hand on his daughter's head. The watching became their shared ritual: polish, count, breathe, sweep. She learned where the cloth needed to turn to make glass sing with cleanliness, learned that care has its own rhythm, and that people can feel it even across miles of dark water. Elena taught a different kind of temporal wisdom, one measured not in lighthouse sweeps, but in the patient breathing of tides. At low water, when the sea pulled back its green curtain to reveal the secret theatres of the shore, mother and daughter would cross the rack line to the tide pools that winked like small bright eyes set into the rocky coast. "Wait," Elena would say, not with impatience, but with the reverence of someone who understood that the best things reveal themselves only to those willing to be still. Sea anemones folded their delicate mouths at the slightest shadow, then opened again if a person was steady enough to let the moment lengthen. "They're not plants," Elena murmured, crouched beside Iris with her finger hovering an inch above a ring of pale tentacles. "They only pretend to be still. Give them time to trust you." Iris discovered that if she softened the part of herself that wanted to reach and touch, if she set down her eagerness like a heavy bucket and simply stayed present, the tentacles would unfurl like slow petals and show colors so rich they felt like secrets. Rose, wine green as broken bottles made kind by the sea. In these tide pools, Iris learned that every creature moved at its own pace, and that patience was not waiting, but participating in a different kind of time altogether. Hermit crabs emerged from their borrowed shells to explore new homes with less of their characteristic skittish haste when she was near. Even the shy octopi that usually fled at the first sign of human approach would linger in the shallow pools, their skin cycling through patterns of camouflage like slow liquid thought, as if her presence gave them permission to be unhurried in their ancient, careful dance of survival. One afternoon in late spring, when the air smelled of wild roses and the promise of summer, they witnessed something that made Elena pause in her note-taking and reach for Iris's hand. A small starfish, no bigger than a child's palm, had been caught in a particularly shallow pool as the tide receded. The sun was strong, and the water was warming dangerously, threatening the creature's survival. As they watched, Iris felt that familiar stirring in her chest, the same gentle pulling she experienced in the lighthouse when ships needed guidance. Without conscious thought, she knelt beside the pool and placed her hand flat on the sun-warmed rock. The water, which had been evaporating steadily in the heat, seemed to hold its level just a little longer. A small wave, probably the wake of a distant boat, arrived at exactly the right moment to refresh the pool with cooler water. The starfish, given this unexpected reprieve, slowly made its way to the deeper edge of the pool where it would be safe when the next tide arrived. Elena squeezed her daughter's hand gently. "You're good at this," she said softly, "at letting things take the time they need." It was the closest either parent had come to naming what they both sensed, that their daughter existed in a slightly different relationship with time than the rest of the world, and that this gift seemed to bring only beauty and protection to the moments it touched. The cottage itself seemed to breathe with these gentler rhythms. Mornings stretched like warm honey, especially when the sun was kind and the kitchen smelled of Elena's coffee and the bread she baked twice a week. The sounds of their daily life, Samuel's tools, the distant cry of gulls, the soft argument between wind and curtains, would often linger in ways that felt more real, more deeply etched in memory than moments that rushed past unnoticed. Sometimes, when Iris helped her mother in the small garden behind the cottage, butterflies would arrive and seem reluctant to leave. They would rest on her shoulders, her hair, her outstretched hands, their wings moving with the slow grace of underwater dancers. Eleanor learned to keep her camera ready for these moments, capturing images of her daughter surrounded by living jewels of orange and black, monarchs and painted ladies and small blues that turned her into a breathing flower garden. "They're tired," Iris would explain, when the butterflies finally lifted away toward their distant destinations. "They needed to rest before they fly to the warm place." And Elena would nod, understanding that her daughter was becoming something more than they had expected, not a controller of time, but a tender guardian of moments that needed extra space to unfold completely. As summer deepened and the lighthouse welcomed its annual parade of whale-watching boats and sunset cruises, Iris began to notice other children on the beach below the cliff. There was one boy in particular, smaller than the kite he was trying to fly, who would appear on calm afternoons when the wind was just strong enough to lift dreams, but not quite strong enough to hold them steady. His shoulders had the shape of someone braced against being hurried, and from her perch in the lighthouse gallery, Iris could feel time around him snag and flutter. Uncertain whether to slow or speed, she didn't go down to the beach, not yet. She only watched, learning his outline against the white-capped water and the gulls that stitched patterns through the sky. But she found herself holding her breath when his kite rose, releasing it slowly when the bright fabric found its balance and danced against the blue. It was practice, she realized later, for the deeper work that was coming. Learning to recognize when someone needed the gift of unhurried time, when a moment deserved the grace of being held just a little longer, when the world's relentless pace could be softened by the simple act of paying attention with love. That evening, as the lighthouse beam drew its bright seam across the darkening water and the cottage filled with the comfortable sounds of family, dishes, laughter, the soft tick of Samuel's pocket watch, Iris lay in her small bed and listened to the ocean's eternal conversation with the shore. "Not our light, we keep it," she thought, and felt the truth of those words expanding to include something larger. "Not our time either, but we can hold space for it to be kind." In the soft hour before sleep, that felt like enough of a beginning. The morning after Iris had watched the boy struggle with his restless kite, she found herself drawn down the cliff path before her father finished his lighthouse rounds, before her mother had even tied her hair back for the day's tide pool observations. The beach was dressed in the soft colors of early light, pearl sand, silver-green water, gulls stepping like careful dancers along the foam line. And there, exactly where she had seen him from the lighthouse gallery, was the boy with hair that couldn't decide which way the wind wanted it to go. He was crouched near the water's edge, not with his kite this time, but with something smaller cupped in his palms. As Iris approached across the cool sand, she could hear the shape of words that wanted to come, but kept catching on themselves, syllables that started and stopped like a small engine trying to find its rhythm. He looked up when her shadow fell across his patch of beach, and his eyes were the color of sea glass with flecks of brown like sand stirred into shallow water. "Hello," he said, and Iris felt that familiar stirring in her chest, the same gentle pulling she experienced when the lighthouse beam wanted to linger over uncertain waters. Without thinking about it, without even understanding what she was doing, she settled into the kind of stillness she had learned from watching sea anemones, the patient presence that gave shy creatures permission to emerge at their own pace. "Hi," she said simply, and then waited. Not the fidgety waiting of someone eager to fill silence, but the deeper waiting of someone who understood that good things reveal themselves only to those willing to let time move at its own speed. She watched him carefully open his cupped hands to reveal a small, smooth stone, worn by countless tides into the shape of something that might have been a sleeping seal. "I could collect them," he said, and this time the words came a little easier, as if the space between them had grown softer somehow. Seconds. When the W waves pull back, there's a small quiet. If you could count to 10 without the water interrupting, that's a second worth keeping. He showed her the deep pockets sewn along the inside of his shirt, a careful patchwork of old cloth and new thread that answered with the small music of stones sliding over each other when he moved. Iris nodded, understanding more in her chest than in her head. "Can I help you find one?" she asked, and he handed her the smooth stone with the seriousness of someone sharing a treasure. Together they stood at the edge of the wet sand, ankles cooled by the outgoing foam, and waited for the moment when the sea pulled back its lace curtain to reveal the gleaming stage beneath. "Now," he whispered, and they began counting together. 1, 2, 3, his numbers catching slightly but finding their rhythm. 4, 5, 6. Iris felt the ocean's patience, the way it wanted to rush back but was willing to wait, just this once, for two children to reach 10 together. 7, 8, 9, and in that space between the last wave and the next, time seemed to pool like water finding its level, gentle and unhurried and kind. 10, they said together, and Finn bent to choose a new stone from the wet sand, this one the color of twilight, smooth as silk and warm from the morning sun. He dropped it into one of his sewn pockets with a small smile of satisfaction. "That's a good one," he said, "for later when I need it." His name was Finn, he told her as they walked along the water's edge, searching for the perfect stones that held seconds like small, smooth prayers. His mother worked nights at the hospital sometimes, bringing home the smell of antiseptic that reminded him of rain. His father sent postcards with boats on them from up the coast where the work was, and Finn kept them in a shoebox under his bed, reading the backs until he knew the handwriting like a song he could hum without thinking. They built a sandcastle because it seemed required by the day, because the shape of a bucket pressed upside down into wet sand still feels like magic, no matter how many times you do it. Iris ran her finger along the edges to smooth them, and Finn, careful with his gentle hands, pressed shells in a neat line around the base, like punctuation marks in a story written in sand. When a larger wave ran up farther than expected, threatening their morning's work, Iris felt the familiar tug in her chest and placed her palm lightly on the castle's highest tower, barely touching, almost just thinking, and the water spread thin around the base like a careful skirt and withdrew without taking anything it hadn't brought. Finn's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't say anything about magic. He just breathed out and said, Good," as if something precious had been given exactly enough time to become itself completely. Elena, watching from the cottage garden where she was hanging laundry on the line, noticed how the two children moved together with unusual harmony. There was no rushing, no impatience, no attempts to finish each other's sentences or fill the spaces where words gathered themselves for speaking. Instead, there was something she could only describe as temporal, kindness, a quality of attention that gave Finn's thoughts room to unfold completely and gave Iris's gift a natural purpose, for that felt as right as breathing. When Finn grew tired of building, he showed Iris the true art of collecting seconds. They would stand side by side, feet in the cool rush of the outgoing water, and the moment the foam thinned to lace, they would start counting together. Iris felt how the world liked to rush the edges of moments, how the incoming wave wanted to interrupt, how Finn's numbers found their smoothest rhythm when the silence grew generous around them. When they reached 10, they would choose their token, a piece of sea glass green as bottle dreams, a fragment of driftwood carved by salt, into something that looked like a letter in a language they didn't yet read, or another small stone polished by patience into perfection. "Do you ever open them?" Iris asked finally, nodding toward his rich collection of pockets. The question felt private, but Finn didn't guard it. "When I need them," he said, pulling out a flat, pale stone that had been rubbed by time into a softness that invited the thumb, like now. Talking is hard sometimes. People look away or they finish my words before I can. But if I can find us a second, I can finish what I'm a mean to say." He took a breath, held the stone gently against his chest like a promise, and looked at her with eyes that held the patient depth of tide pools. "You don't look away. I like your seconds," she said. "They feel like good company." He smiled then, quick and shy, and offered her the pale stone. "You can have this one. It's been waiting for the right person." When she took it, it was warm from his pocket and the sun, and something else, like the feeling that had filled the kitchen when her grandmother's laughter hung in the air, and time opened like a flower to hold the music a little longer. That evening, as Iris helped Samuel polish the lighthouse lens and prepare for the night's work, she found herself thinking about the rhythm of Finn's speech, the way his words wanted to come, but sometimes needed extra space to find their way into the world. It reminded her of the way tide pools revealed their treasures, not all at once, but gradually, to those patient enough to wait and watch and listen. "Dad," she said as they worked together in the golden light of late afternoon, "why do some people talk fast and some people talk slow?" Samuel considered the question with the same careful attention he brought to adjusting the lighthouse beacon, understanding that his daughter was asking about something deeper than conversation. "I think everyone has their own rhythm," he said slowly, wiping his cloth across the great lens in smooth circular motions. "Like the ocean. Sometimes it's rough and quick. Sometimes it's calm and steady. The important thing is to listen for the rhythm, not just the words." He paused and looked at his daughter, with eyes that had spent decades reading weather and water, and the subtle signs that told him when ships needed extra guidance. Some of the most important things take time to say properly. That night, as the lighthouse beam began its patient sweep across the darkening water, and the cottage filled with the comfortable sounds of evening, Iris sat by her window with Finn's pale stone in her palm and listened to the eternal conversation between wind and waves. Through the glass, she could just make out the cottage with the lace curtains where the elderly neighbor lived, and if she listened carefully, she could hear the faint, hesitant melody of a music box that seemed to be trying to remember a waltz it had once danced perfectly. The day had found its way into her heart. Kite dreams and pocketed seconds, the way a boy's courage could look like counting to 10 without hurrying, the discovery that her gift was meant not for keeping, but for sharing. She thought of Finn walking home along the beach path, his pockets heavy with collected moments, and felt a new understanding settle into place like a tide finding its level. Some people needed extra time to let their words bloom, and some people, like her, were meant to help create the gentle spaces where that blooming could happen safely. Outside, the lighthouse beam swept its bright line across the water and then erased it again and again, keeping its patient watch over all the travelers trying to find their way home through the darkness. And somewhere in the rhythm of that faithful light, Iris heard an echo of the lesson she was learning, that the most important gifts are not the ones we keep, but the ones we tend with love, so they can do what they were made to do in the world. The hesitant waltz that drifted through Iris's bedroom window each evening had become as familiar as the lighthouse beam's steady sweep, a melody that wanted to dance but kept stumbling over its own mechanical feet. It came from the cottage with lace curtains, where Mrs. Holloway lived in the gentle solitude of someone who had learned to keep good company with memory. The music would start bravely each night, then falter and catch, like someone trying to remember the steps to a dance they had once known by heart. 3 mornings after her beach walk with Finn, Iris was helping Elena gather the last wild roses of the season when they encountered Mrs. Holloway, tending her small garden of hardy coastal flowers. The older woman straightened slowly from her marigolds, one hand pressed to the small of her back, and her face creased into the kind of smile that had weathered decades of salt air and still found genuine pleasure in the sight of neighbors. "Good morning, dear ones," she called, her voice carrying the warm cadence of someone who had once read bedtime stories to children. Her hair was the color of sea foam, pinned back with a mother-of-pearl comb that had lost a chip somewhere along the years, and her eyes held the patient depth of tide pools. "Eleanor, those roses are particularly lovely this season. And Iris, my goodness, you're growing tall as the lighthouse itself." Eleanor paused at the garden gate, and Iris felt her mother's natural kindness reaching toward the older woman like morning light seeking a window. "Mrs. Holloway, would you like some roses for your table? We have more than we can use." The offer was genuine, but Iris sensed something deeper in her mother's attention. The way Eleanor noticed the slight tremor in Mrs. Holloway's hands as she held her garden shears, the careful way she moved, as if her body had become something that required negotiation rather than simple cooperation. "That would be lovely," Mrs. Holloway said, opening the gate with fingers that had to work harder than they once had. "Perhaps you'd like to come in for tea. I was just about to put the kettle on, and the house feels too quiet sometimes." She looked at Iris with eyes that remained sharp and kind, despite being set in a face that had learned to carry the weight of many years. "I don't get much company these days." The cottage interior was exactly what Iris had imagined. Small rooms made cozy with well-loved furniture, walls lined with photographs of people in old-fashioned clothes, who smiled with the formality of an era when having your picture taken was still an occasion. The air held a gentle museum of scents, lavender sachets, the particular sweetness that comes from years of baking in the same kitchen, and underneath it all, the faint smell of lemon oil and old books. But it was the music box that drew Iris's attention immediately. It sat on the mantelpiece above a small fireplace, carved from dark walnut and inlaid with mother-of-pearl in delicate patterns that caught the afternoon light. Even silent, it seemed to pulse with mechanical longing, and when Mrs. Holloway wound the brass key with hands that trembled slightly, the familiar melody began, but wrong, all wrong. The waltz lurched through its phrases like someone walking with an injured leg, the notes tumbling over each other in places, dragging painfully in others. "It belonged to my late husband's grandmother," Mrs. Holloway said softly, settling into a chair that had been shaped by decades of her particular way of sitting. "She brought it from the old country when she was just a girl. It used to play the most beautiful waltz, but something's gone wrong with the mechanism over the years. It still tries to sing, but it's forgotten how to breathe properly." Iris moved closer to the mantelpiece, drawn by something she couldn't name. The music box seemed to struggle against some invisible weight, wanting to dance but unable to find its natural rhythm. Without thinking, she reached toward it with the same gentle attention she had learned to offer sea anemones and moments that needed extra space to unfold. Her small hand hovered just above the carved surface, not quite touching but close enough to feel the mechanical heartbeat struggling inside. She softened the part of herself that wanted to fix, and instead she listened, so completely that listening became a kind of presence, a room made of attention, where the melody could remember what it had always meant to say. The waltz, given this gentle space, began to find its natural tempo. The notes that had been catching on invisible snags started to flow like water finding its level. The melody unfolded with the grace it had been designed for, each phrase completing itself without hurry or hesitation. Mrs. Holloway's teacup rattled softly against its saucer as she set it down. "Oh, my dear child," she whispered, watching her precious music box play its perfect waltz for the first time in years. "What did you do?" But there was no fear in the question, only wonder, and the kind of gratitude that comes from having something precious restored when you had given up hope. "It just needed time to remember," Iris said simply, her hand still hovering in that space between touch and thought. The music was still there. It was just tangled up. When the waltz finally wound down to its natural conclusion, the silence that followed felt different, satisfied, complete, like the pause after a prayer has been properly said. Mrs. Holloway rose and moved to the mantelpiece, winding the key again with fingers that no longer trembled. The melody began again, perfect and unhurried, filling the small cottage with a beauty that spoke of dancing in kitchens with crooked floors and love that defied the erosion of years. "My husband used to say," Mrs. Holloway murmured, watching the music box with bright eyes, "that the trick isn't fixing time, it's keeping good company with it." She looked at Iris with the expression of someone recognizing a kindred spirit. "You're very good company, dear heart. Would you like to visit again? I think we understand each other." That afternoon, as they walked home along the cliff path, with the sound of the perfectly restored waltz still echoing in memory, Elena squeezed her daughter's hand gently. She had watched Iris work her quiet magic on the struggling mechanism, had seen the way time seemed to soften around her child, like honey warmed by sunlight. "You made her very happy," she said softly. "Sometimes the most important gifts are the ones that help people remember what they thought they had lost forever." Iris nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle into the growing collection of wisdom she was gathering like Finn gathered his seconds. The pale stone he had given her was warm in her pocket, and she could still feel the echo of the music box's mechanical heartbeat, now steady and sure as her father's lighthouse beam. Some things, she was learning, just needed someone to listen carefully enough to hear what they were trying to say, and patient enough to give them the time they needed to say it properly. That night, as she lay in her small bed, listening to the ocean's eternal conversation with the shore, she could hear Mrs. Holloway's music box playing its perfect waltz through the walls between cottages. The melody drifted on the salt air like a lullaby, and Iris smiled in the darkness, understanding that she had found another piece of her purpose, not just to slow moments when they needed slowing, but to help restore the natural rhythms that made life beautiful, one gentle adjustment at a time. The lighthouse beam swept its patient arc across the water, and somewhere in its steady rhythm, she heard an echo of the lesson she was learning, that the most important gifts are not the ones we keep, but the ones we tend with love, so they can do what they were made to do in the world. The morning after Mrs. Holloway's music box had found its perfect waltz again, the air carried a different quality, heavier somehow, as if the sky had been holding a long breath and was preparing to exhale with considerable force. Samuel stood at the cottage window with his morning coffee, watching the horizon wear a thin line of pewter that hadn't been there at sunrise. The gulls, usually content to ride the bright thermals above the cliff, stayed low over the dunes, their cries carrying an edge of unease that made the lighthouse keeper reach unconsciously for his grandfather's pocket watch. "Weather's changing," he murmured to Elena, who was already moving through the cottage with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to read her husband's moods as clearly. As he read the seas, she began the quiet choreography of preparation, checking the battery radio, filling the large water jugs, making sure the oil lamps were clean and ready. The lighthouse had its own generator, but storms had their own opinions about what should continue working, and coastal families learned early to prepare for the possibility that familiar comforts might decide to take temporary leave. There was an inspection scheduled for that afternoon. 2. The annual visit where someone from the Coast Guard Marine Safety Office would climb the spiral stairs, peer at the great lens through careful eyes, and ask after the health of both machinery and keeper. Samuel had received word that Inspector Marta Quinn would be driving the coastal road before noon, hoping to complete her examination and return across the Causeway Bridge before the E. Weather showed its true intentions. Iris helped by securing the outdoor furniture and checking that the cottage shutters were properly latched, her movements careful and deliberate as she felt something building in the air around them, not just the storm's physical pressure, but a temporal restlessness that made her gift hum with anticipation. The wind was beginning its low conversation with the cottage walls, and she could sense time itself growing impatient, wanting to rush through the next several hours without paying proper attention to what might be pushed aside in its haste. By mid-morning, the first serious gusts were testing the lighthouse structure, and the sea had begun to lose its patience with being merely beautiful. Inspector Quinn arrived in a sturdy Coast Guard vehicle, her curly hair escaping from beneath a regulation cap that she adjusted with the easy competence of someone who had learned to work in all weather. She carried a metal equipment case and moved with purpose but not hurry, acknowledging the building storm with respect rather than fear. "Thank you for accommodating the schedule," she said to Samuel as they shook hands at the lighthouse entrance. Her voice carried the steady warmth of someone who understood that keeping lights burning was both technical work and sacred trust. "I'm hoping we can complete this efficiently. The weather service is calling for significant deterioration by late afternoon." She glanced at Iris with kind eyes that seemed to notice more than they examined. "You must be the keeper's daughter. I've heard good things about how well you help maintain this station." As they climbed the 43 spiral steps together, Marta shared stories of other lighthouses along the coast, her voice creating a comfortable rhythm that matched their ascending footsteps. "There's an old clockmaker up in Millbrook," she mentioned as they paused at the service room landing. "Henrik Larsson, been repairing timepieces for 60 years, and he has this theory that every mechanism has its own heartbeat. Says if you can hear the rhythm, you'll know when something needs tending." Her words seemed to find their way directly to Iris's understanding, settling there like seeds in good soil. In the lantern room, Marta began her methodical examination of the great Fresnel lens, checking each component with the reverent attention of someone who understood that this beacon represented the difference between safe harbor and disaster for countless vessels. Outside the curved windows, the world was transforming. The sea changing from bottle green to slate gray, the wind finding its voice in increasingly urgent registers. "Lens rotation mechanism is operating beautifully," Marta murmured, making notes on her inspection form. "You've kept this equipment in remarkable condition." But even as she spoke, Iris could feel the storm gathering itself into something more focused and immediate. The barometric pressure was dropping faster than seemed natural, and the lighthouse beam, though still functioning perfectly, seemed to be cutting through air that had grown thick and restless. Through the gallery windows, they could see the causeway bridge in the distance, the only route back to the mainland. The tide was rising, and if the storm arrived with its full force while Marta was still conducting her inspection, that bridge would become impassable, trapping her at the lighthouse until the weather cleared. The thought sent a chill through Iris that had nothing to do with the cooling air. That was when she felt it, a shift in the storm's rhythm that made her temporal sensitivity flare like a struck match. The wind, which had been building steadily, suddenly gathered itself into something more urgent and demanding. The rain, which had been threatening all morning, began to fall not in the gentle patter of ordinary weather, but in sheets that turned the world beyond the windows into something grey and indistinct. "Perhaps we should move to complete the exterior inspection quickly," Marta said, glancing at the weather with the practiced assessment of someone who had learned to work within nature's schedule, rather than against it. But Iris could feel the storm's impatience, its eagerness to demonstrate its power by reshaping the familiar landscape into something more dramatic and dangerous. Without thinking about it, without even understanding the full scope of what she was attempting, Iris placed her palm gently against the curved glass of the lantern room and reached out with the same patient attention she had offered Mrs. Holloway's struggling music box. The storm was vast and wild, and completely beyond any human ability to control. But perhaps, just perhaps, it might be willing to moderate its most violent arrival by a few precious minutes. She felt the wind's enthusiasm, its natural exuberance like a child who had been given permission to run as fast as possible and had forgotten to pay attention to the more fragile things in its path. "Please," she whispered to the storm, not asking it to stop or change direction, but simply requesting the courtesy of a slightly more gradual crescendo. She needs time to finish her work and get home safely. The pressure in the lantern room eased slightly, and the rain, while still serious in its intentions, pulled back just enough to allow clear visibility across the lighthouse grounds. The wind continued its conversation with the structure, but with less urgency, as if it had been reminded of its manners and was willing to wait a few more minutes before showing its full strength. Marta completed her exterior inspection with efficient thoroughness, checking the lightning rod, the gallery railings, and the beacon housing, while the storm held itself in a state of restrained anticipation. When she finished, and they descended to the cottage for her final paperwork, the weather seemed to exhale and settle into its natural rhythm, still powerful, still magnificent, but no longer rushing toward its climax, with the impatience that might have made the difference between a difficult drive and an impossible one. "Perfect timing," Marta said, as she packed her equipment case, glancing at the windows where rain was now falling with serious intent. "I should be able to make it across the causeway before the worst arrives." She turned to Samuel with a smile that acknowledged both professional satisfaction and personal gratitude. "This is one of the finest maintained stations I've inspected. You should be proud of the work you're doing here." To Iris, she offered something more personal, a small card with a hand-drawn map on the back. "That clockmaker I mentioned, Henrik? He holds repair workshops on Saturday mornings at the Maritime Museum in Millbrook. If you're ever interested in learning more about how timepieces work, he'd be delighted to meet someone who obviously understands the importance of keeping things running smoothly." Her eyes held a gentle recognition, as if she sensed something special about the lighthouse keeper's daughter, without needing to name it. As Marta's vehicle disappeared down the cliff road toward the mainland, the storm seemed to remember its original intentions. The wind returned with renewed purpose, the rain intensified, and the lighthouse settled into its eternal role as a beacon of safety in the darkness. But it had granted the small courtesy Iris had requested, a few extra minutes of gentleness that allowed a dedicated inspector to complete her work and return safely to her own harbor. That night, as the nor'easter spent its energy rearranging the coastal landscape and the lighthouse beam swept its patient arc across waters that had turned wild and magnificent, Iris lay in her small bed and listened to the storm's powerful symphony. She had learned something profound during those moments in the lantern room, that her gift could extend beyond intimate moments to larger rhythms when the need was great enough and the request was made with proper respect. The storm had taught her about the difference between controlling and collaborating, between demanding and asking politely for consideration. She thought of Henrik the clockmaker, whose name already sounded like patience, and felt a new chapter of her understanding beginning to unfold. Some people were meant to tend the mechanisms that kept the world running smoothly, whether they were lighthouse beacons or music boxes or the delicate clockwork of time itself. Outside, the wind continued its ancient argument with the sea, but Iris felt only peace in her chest. She was learning to be a keeper of more than just moments. She was becoming a guardian of the spaces where time could be kind, where the world's relentless pace could be softened by the simple act of paying attention with love. And somewhere in the storm's wild music, she heard an echo of the lesson that was becoming the foundation of everything she would become, that the most important gifts are not the ones we keep, but the ones we tend with gentle hands so they can do what they were made to do in the world. The morning after the storm had spent itself against the coast, leaving behind air that tasted of salt and new beginnings, Inspector Quinn's card sat on the kitchen table like a quiet invitation. The hand-drawn map on its back showed the route to Millbrook in careful pencil strokes, and beneath it, in neat handwriting, were the words Saturday mornings. Maritime Museum Workshop. Iris found herself drawn to the card during breakfast, her fingers tracing the simple lines that promised something she couldn't yet name but felt in her chest, like a gentle pulling toward deeper understanding. Helen noticed her daughter's attention lingering on the small rectangle of cardstock and smiled with the knowing expression of someone who recognized the moment when curiosity transforms into purpose. "Shall we see about this clockmaker who listens to timepieces like they're telling him secrets?" she asked. And the words felt like permission to follow the thread that had been tugging at Iris's awareness since the lighthouse inspection. The drive to Millbrook took them across the causeway bridge and up the coastal road, past fishing villages still rearranging themselves after the storm's enthusiastic redecorating. The Maritime Museum waited in the town's heart, a sturdy brick building that had once served as a ship chandler's warehouse, its thick walls and tall windows speaking of an era when time moved at the pace of wind and tide, rather than the relentless urgency of modern life. Inside, the workshop occupied a corner room where the afternoon light fell in golden rectangles across workbenches, arranged with the same thoughtful precision Iris recognized from her father's lighthouse equipment. The air held a particular atmosphere, warm and patient, scented with lemon oil, brass polish, and something sweet that turned out to be honey cakes cooling on a windowsill. But most remarkably, the room was filled with a soft symphony of ticking, dozens of timepieces creating not chaos, but a gentle rain of mechanical heartbeats that seemed to welcome visitors into their temporal Sanctuary. Henrik Larsson stood at the central workbench, with his sleeves rolled to reveal forearms marked by decades of careful work. His hair was silver white, swept back from a face that held the patient lines of someone who had learned to work with time rather than against it, and his eyes, magnified slightly by wire-rimmed spectacles, carried the quiet depth of tide pools. When he looked up from the delicate mechanism spread before him, his gaze found Iris with the recognition of someone who had been expecting her arrival. "You must be the lighthouse keeper's daughter," he said, his voice carrying the warm cadence of someone who had learned English as a second language and chosen to keep the musical rhythm of his first. "Marta Quinn spoke of you with great interest. She said you have a way of understanding what things need to work properly again." He removed his magnifying loupe and gestured toward the workbench with hands that moved like prayers made visible. "I have been wondering when you would come." The workshop felt immediately familiar to Iris, like stepping into a place she had been dreaming of without knowing it. Henrik moved between his tools and timepieces, with the same reverent attention her father brought to tending the lighthouse beacon, and she understood instinctively that this was another kind of keeping, not of light, but of the mechanisms that helped humans measure and honor the passage of time. "Before we can repair," Henrik said, settling onto a tall stool and inviting Iris to join him at the workbench, "we must first learn the art of listening. Every clock, every watch, every mechanism that counts moments has its own heartbeat. Some beat quickly, like nervous birds. Others move slowly, like deep breathing. The secret is not to impose our rhythm upon them, but to discover the rhythm they were born to keep." He placed a small carriage clock on a blue cloth between them, its case tarnished with age, but its brass fittings still holding the dignity of fine craftsmanship. "This one runs," he explained, tilting it so she could hear its mechanism, "but it doesn't know how to breathe properly. Listen, do you hear how the tick and tock are uneven? One side of the swing is greedy, the other side is shy. A clock's escapement lets time through in equal portions. When it's out of balance, it forgets that patience should be symmetrical." Iris leaned closer until the clock's struggling heartbeat filled her. Awareness. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The imbalance was subtle but unmistakable, like a picture hanging slightly crooked that tugs at your attention until you must make it true again. She felt that familiar stirring in her chest, the same gentle pulling she experienced when moments needed extra space to unfold completely. Without thinking about technique or method, she softened the part of herself that wanted to fix and instead offered the kind of patient presence she had learned from watching sea anemones reveal their hidden colors. Her breathing slowed naturally, and gradually, as if relieved to find such understanding company, the clock's rhythm began to even itself. Tick-tock, tick-tock, like paired footsteps finding their natural harmony. Henrik nodded with the satisfaction of someone recognizing an answer to a question he had posed long ago. "Good," he said simply. "You didn't force it. You invited it to remember what it could be." He picked up a slender tool and made the smallest adjustment to a tiny screw. "So you've given it a picture of its true rhythm. Now we ask gently with our instruments to help it stay there." The afternoon passed in a meditation of small, precise movements. Henrik showed her the essential components without drowning her in technical names. The balance wheel that swung like a tiny seesaw between wanting to go and remembering to wait. The hairspring coiled like a delicate snail shell made of steel. The escapement that served as time's gatekeeper, allowing moments to pass in respectful increments rather than rushing forward in an undignified tumble. "Every clock has a gatekeeper," Henrik explained as they worked together on a pocket watch that had lost its confidence decades ago. "It doesn't own time. It keeps it, so it can do what it was made to do." The words settled into the familiar groove in Iris's mind, where her father's lighthouse wisdom lived, and she felt something in her understanding stand taller, more certain of its purpose. Other students came and went throughout the afternoon, an elderly fisherman with a ship's clock that had forgotten how to chime, a young mother carrying her grandmother's kitchen timer that insisted on stopping at 5 minutes, no matter how carefully it was wound. Henrik made room for each of them with the same quiet courtesy, teaching not just repair techniques, but the deeper posture of tending, the patience required to work with rather than against the natural rhythms of mechanical things. When there was a lull in the gentle tide of visitors, Henrik placed a small wooden metronome on the bench between them and set its arms swinging with a soft Honest click-click-click that felt like a heartbeat made audible. "Useful little friends," he said, watching the steady pendulum with appreciation. "They don't demand. They offer steadiness. Musicians know how to lean into them when their own rhythm is lost." He slid the metronome closer to Iris, its wooden voice creating a patient anchor in the workshop's symphony of ticking. "You have a friend, I think, whose words sometimes stumble when they try to run too quickly. Give him a place to stand that doesn't hurry him. You needn't show him the metronome itself. You can become it for him." "How?" Iris asked, though she felt the answer already forming in the soft understanding of her hands. Henrik smiled with the expression of someone sharing a secret that was meant to be passed along. He placed 2 weathered fingers on the workbench and tapped a pattern so gentle it felt like the thought of a touch. 4 soft beats, he said, like a calm heart at rest. "Tap on your knee or on the back of a chair, or only inside your breathing. Let him find you the way a ship finds a lighthouse beacon. He will learn to speak on the 4th beat when it feels safe. If he chooses the 3rd, honor that choice. The point isn't control, it's companionship." As the afternoon light began to slant through the workshop windows, painting everything in honey-colored warmth, Henrik gave Iris a small toolkit wrapped in soft leather, delicate instruments that would look like toys in careless hands but carried the weight of sacred purpose in hers. "Borrow these," he said. "Tools don't like to belong to anyone permanently. They prefer to be in motion between people who use them with respect." On the drive home, as the lighthouse came into view wearing the evening light, like a comfortable old sweater, Iris held the metronome's steady rhythm inside her chest, the way some people carry a favorite song. 4 gentle beats, a place to stand, a harbor for words that needed time to find their courage. She thought of Finn walking the beach with his pockets full of collected seconds, of the way his thoughts gathered at the edge of sentences like tide pools, waiting for the right moment to reveal their treasures. That evening, as the lighthouse beam began its patient sweep across the darkening water, and Mrs. Holloway's perfectly restored waltz drifted through the cottage walls, Iris practiced the art of being quiet company for the timepieces in her own home. Samuel's pocket watch rested in its dish by the door, ticking with the calm authority of something that had been keeping faithful time for generations. She held Finn's pale stone in her palm and matched its remembered warmth to the metronome's invisible sway, understanding that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to offer the gift of unhurried time to someone who needed it. Outside, the ocean continued its eternal conversation with the shore, and in its ancient rhythm, Iris heard an echo of the lesson that was becoming the foundation of everything she was learning to become, that the most important gifts are not the ones we keep, but the ones we tend with patient hands and understanding hearts, so they can do what they were made to do in the world. The lighthouse beam swept its bright arc across the water, and somewhere in its steady rhythm, she felt her own purpose settling more firmly into place, not to control time but to keep good company with it, creating gentle spaces where others might find their way to their truest rhythms. The Monday morning after Iris returned from Henrik's workshop carried the particular weight of anticipation that settles over small coastal towns when children must stand before their peers and reveal something precious about themselves. She found Finn waiting by the lighthouse gate, his shoulders carrying the familiar tension of someone bracing against an approaching storm, though this tempest lived entirely in the space between his thoughts and his voice. "Presentation day," he said, the words careful as stepping stones placed across uncertain water. His pockets made their soft music of collected stones, but his usual calm had been replaced by something that looked like a small bird caught against glass, all nervous energy with nowhere safe to land. "About hermit crabs, I know everything about them, but standing up there, with everyone waiting for words that might not come," Iris felt her newly awakened understanding reach toward him with the same gentle attention she had learned to offer struggling timepieces. She could sense the way his thoughts wanted to flow smoothly, but kept encountering invisible obstacles, like tide pools trying to refill while debris blocked their channels. The 4-beat rhythm Henrik had taught her began to pulse quietly in her awareness, not as something to impose, but as a steady anchor she could offer if he needed it. "Would you like to practice?" she asked, settling onto the stone wall that bordered the lighthouse grounds. The morning air carried salt and the distant conversation of gulls, and she made herself into the kind of patient presence She had learned from watching sea anemones, still enough that shy creatures might feel safe enough to emerge. Finn's eyes found hers with the grateful expression of someone who had been hoping for exactly this offer but hadn't known how to ask. He pulled a crumpled paper from his jacket pocket, edges worn soft from nervous handling, and smoothed it against his knee with hands that trembled slightly. It's about how hermit crabs choose new shells when they outgrow the old ones, how they have to be brave enough to be vulnerable for a moment between homes. The parallel wasn't lost on either of them. The courage required to step out of familiar protection and trust that something better was waiting. Iris began the gentle tap of 4 beats against the stone wall, so softly it might have been mistaken for morning settling into its rhythm, creating a steady anchor that didn't demand attention but offered itself as a place to stand. Finn took a breath that seemed to reach all the way down to his toes, and on the 4th beat, exactly as Henrik had predicted, he began to speak. "Hermit crabs don't actually make their own shells," he said, his voice finding its natural current in the space between her gentle taps. "They find empty shells left by other sea creatures and move in like tenants in houses someone else built perfectly for them." The words came easier now, flowing with the patient rhythm she was creating. Iris watched his shoulders relax as he discovered he could trust this steady beat, that it would hold firm for him no matter how long his thoughts needed to organize themselves. When he reached the complex part about how crabs form chains to help each other find properly sized homes, she felt him hesitate, and she simply maintained the quiet 4-beat pattern, letting him know the anchor remained steady. That afternoon, when the schoolhouse filled with the restless energy of children gathered for presentations, Iris sat with Elena in the back row, feeling the familiar hum of her gift as one by one students shared their treasures. When Finn's turn arrived, he walked to the front carrying his collection box with the reverence of someone bearing something sacred. He stood before the assembly, and Iris could see the familiar tension creeping across his features as the room's impatience pressed against him like an incoming tide. Without thinking, without even moving, she began the 4 soft beats in the deepest part of her awareness, not tapping anything physical, but creating a gentle temporal cushion around him, a space where the world's hurry could not reach. "My name is Finn," he began, and this time his voice carried the clear, unhurried cadence of someone who had found his natural rhythm. "And I collect seconds." The words emerged without rushing, each syllable given the space it needed to unfold completely. He opened his collection box and lifted out stones worn smooth by countless tides, each one a captured moment of patience rewarded. "When the waves pull back," he continued, his confidence growing with each unhurried word, "there's a small quiet. If you count to 10 without the water interrupting, that's a second worth keeping." He held up a pale stone that caught the classroom light like captured moonbeam. "This one was collected with my friend. She helps me find the quiet where words can grow safely." The assembly hall fell into complete attention, captivated not just by his words, but by the quality of presence he brought to them. He spoke about hermit crabs who helped each other find homes, about the courage required to leave safety and trust in something better, about the beauty of creatures who understood that growing sometimes meant being vulnerable. When he finished, the applause was not polite obligation, but genuine recognition of something beautiful shared. Afterward, by the coat racks where winter jackets hung like sleeping birds, Finn found her with his face still glowing from the quiet triumph of having been truly heard. He pulled a small dark stone from his deepest pocket, one she had never seen before, polished by time into perfect smoothness. "This one," he said, his voice still carrying its newfound clarity, "is for you. It's the 10th second. The one that feels like forever when you're counting with someone who understands." When she took it, the stone was warm with more than body heat. It carried the weight of courage found, and friendship deepened into something that could weather any storm. That evening, as the lighthouse beam began its patient sweep across the darkening water, Iris held Finn's gift and understood that she had learned something profound about her purpose. She hadn't controlled his words or forced his confidence. She had simply created gentle space where his natural rhythm could emerge safely. The lighthouse beam swept its bright arc across the water, and in its steady rhythm, she heard an echo of the lesson that was becoming the foundation of everything she was learning to become. That the most important gifts are not the ones we keep, but the ones we tend with patient hands, creating sanctuaries where others might discover their own perfect, unhurried voices. The week after Finn's presentation, when his voice had found its steady rhythm, and the whole school had listened with the kind of attention usually reserved for stories told around fires, the lighthouse community began preparing for a different kind of celebration. Elena's cousin Sarah was getting married to David, a quiet fisherman whose hands knew every mood of the local waters, and they had chosen the meadow behind the old stone church for their ceremony, a rolling stretch of wild grass and late-season flowers that caught every blessing and challenge the coastal weather might offer. Sarah had been planning this day for 3 years, ever since David had proposed during a particularly spectacular sunset, when the sky had painted itself in colors that seemed borrowed from a more generous world. She taught at the village school with the patient authority of someone who understood that important things couldn't be rushed, and David worked the fishing boats with the steady reliability of someone who had learned to read the sea's intentions long before the weather service began making its electronic predictions. Together, they moved through the world with the unhurried devotion of people who understood that some things were worth waiting for. The meadow they had chosen was beautiful but exposed, and as the wedding day approached, Samuel found himself checking his instruments with increasing frequency. A low-pressure system was building over the Atlantic, and the forecasts grew more ominous each morning. "They're taking quite a chance with the weather," Elena murmured, arranging the wildflowers they had gathered for the reception tables. "But perhaps that's what love is, trusting that the important moments will find a way to complete themselves properly." Iris helped with the preparations, her hands working automatically, while her attention remained focused on the atmospheric pressure building around them. She could feel the storm's natural enthusiasm, its eagerness to demonstrate the dramatic possibilities of wind and rain, arriving with the impatience of weather that had forgotten its manners. The meadow filled with folding chairs arranged in careful rows, an archway of late roses and autumn branches positioned to catch the best light, and strings of small bulbs that would transform the evening into something magical if the ceremony lasted long enough to need them. Henrik arrived that afternoon, carrying a slim package tied with twine and wearing a well-pressed jacket the color of pewter. He moved with his usual careful grace, but Iris noticed a faint tremor in his hands when he thought no one was watching. Subtle, barely perceptible, but there nonetheless. He caught her observing and smiled with the gentle dignity of someone who had learned to carry uncertainty without letting it define him. "For later," he said, offering the package. "Every celebration needs its own rhythm." Mrs. Holloway appeared with her music box polished to perfection, a something borrowed that Sarah had requested for the guest book table. Finn arrived with his pockets full of collected seconds and a folded paper containing a few lines Sarah had asked him to read, something about patience and shorelines that she felt he would understand better than most. When his eyes found Iris across the meadow, she answered with a small smile that carried the invisible 4-beat rhythm between them, like a bridge made of understanding. By the time guests began taking their seats, the first grey clouds were gathering on the horizon with the purposeful movement of weather that had made up its mind to be dramatic. The officiant, a kind woman whose voice carried the warm authority of someone who had blessed many unions, opened her prayer book as the wind began its low conversation with the meadow grass. Sarah appeared at the meadow's edge in her grandmother's lace dress, moving with the unhurried grace of someone who understood that this walk would be remembered for the rest of her life. David stood beneath the rose archway with his weathered, fisherman's hands clasped behind his back, his face carrying the patient joy of someone who had learned to wait for the things that mattered most. But as the ceremony began, Iris felt time begin to hurry, in the way it always did when important moments were threatened, eager to get to the finish line, impatient with pauses, unkind to delicate words that needed space to bloom properly. The first drops of rain began to test the air like scouts sent ahead of an advancing army, and Iris felt the familiar stirring in her chest. This wasn't just weather. This was a storm threatening to steal a sacred memory, to rush a moment that deserved to unfold with dignity and grace. Without thinking about the scope of what she was attempting, she placed her palm gently against the rough bark of the old oak tree that sheltered one corner of the meadow and reached out with the same patient attention she had learned to offer struggling timepieces. She didn't try to stop the storm. That would be an act of defiance against nature's own intentions. Instead, she offered it the kind of respectful conversation she had learned from her father's lighthouse wisdom. "Please," she whispered to the approaching weather, not demanding but requesting with the courtesy due to forces larger than herself. "They've been waiting so long for this moment. Could you let it complete itself before you show us how magnificent storms can be?" The pressure in the air eased slightly, not disappearing but settling into a more patient rhythm. The scattered drops that had been testing the meadow's readiness seemed to pull back just enough to allow the ceremony its natural unfolding. The wind continued its conversation with the trees, but with less urgency, as if it had been reminded of its manners and was willing to wait a few more minutes before demonstrating its full strength. Sarah and David spoke their vows in voices that weren't loud but carried like well-made boats across calm water. Finn stepped forward at the appointed moment and unfolded his paper with careful hands, finding Iris's eyes halfway through his reading. On the fourth beat of her invisible rhythm, his voice slipped into the clarity that sounded like tidewater, going out over clean stones. "Patience is the shoreline," he read, "where we learn that arrival and return are the same word said at different times. When the rings were exchanged and the kiss shared, when the minister pronounced them married, and the applause rose from the assembled guests like music made of hands." The storm seemed to exhale with satisfaction. As the wedding party began their procession toward the church hall where the reception waited, the rain began to fall, not with violent enthusiasm, but with the gentle steadiness of water that understood it was now part of the celebration, rather than a threat to it. Later, as the reception filled the hall with fiddle music and laughter, Henrik found Iris near the honey cakes and offered his slim package. Inside was a pocket-sized metronome carved from pale wood, its arm delicate but confident. "Some songs prefer to follow your breathing," he said, his eyes bright behind his spectacles. "But when your breath is tired, let this breathe for you." She noticed again the faint tremor in his hands as he demonstrated the mechanism, understanding that even the keepers of rhythm sometimes needed someone to stand beside them when time asked more than they could easily give. That night, as the lighthouse beam swept its patient arc across rain-washed water and the cottage filled with the comfortable sounds of evening settling in, Iris held Henrik's gift and understood that her purpose was expanding beyond intimate moments to encompass the collective heart of community celebration. She had learned to work with the great rhythms of the world, not to control them, but to ask politely for small courtesies, to create gentle spaces where important moments could unfold with the dignity they deserved. The storm raged outside with magnificent power, but Sarah and David's wedding had been completed in its own perfect time, held safe within that brief, unhurried space she had helped create. She was becoming a guardian of life's important moments, a tender keeper of the spaces where hope could take root and love could bloom without being rushed by the world's impatient clock. And in the lighthouse beam's steady sweep across the dark water, she heard again the lesson that was becoming the foundation of everything she was learning to become, that the most important gifts are not the ones we keep, but the ones we tend with gentle hands, so they can do what they were made to do in the world. The Saturday mornings after Sarah and David's wedding settled into a rhythm as reliable as the lighthouse beacon's sweep, with Iris making her weekly pilgrimage to Henrik's workshop, carrying the small wooden metronome he had given her. The Maritime Museum had become a second home, its brick walls and patient atmosphere offering sanctuary from the world's relentless hurry. But as autumn deepened and the coastal light grew more precious, she began to notice subtle changes in the workshop's familiar choreography. Henrik's hands, which had moved with the fluid precision of water finding its level, now carried a faint tremor that made the delicate work of clock repair increasingly challenging. It was barely perceptible at first, a slight hesitation when placing a tiny gear, a moment of unsteadiness when adjusting a hairspring. But gradually the tremor became a more insistent presence, a constant negotiation between his will and his aging body that made him pause more frequently, his breath catching in small frustrated sighs. "These old friends," he would murmur, looking at his weathered hands with the patient sadness of someone watching beloved companions grow frail. "They remember every conversation they've had with these mechanisms, for 60 years. But sometimes they forget how to hold the word steady. He would flex his fingers, watching them shake with the detached curiosity of someone observing weather patterns beyond his control. One grey morning, when the workshop felt especially warm against the autumn chill, Henrik was working on a piece that seemed to pulse with particular significance, an antique astronomical clock whose face mapped the heavens in miniature, its movements designed to track celestial rhythms with patient accuracy. The clock had belonged to a ship's navigator, and its intricate mechanism could chart the phases of the moon, predict tidal patterns, and mark the slow procession of stars across the night sky. But its escapement had ceased, its celestial dance brought to a halt by time's own accumulated wear. "It needs the steadiest hand I've ever possessed," Henrik said, setting down his tools with a quiet clatter that spoke of deep frustration. "And mine, it seems, have chosen this moment to remember they are mortal." He looked at the frozen clock face with an expression of profound disappointment, not in the mechanism, but in his own limitations. Iris felt that familiar stirring in her chest, the same gentle pulling she experienced when moments needed extra space to unfold completely. But this was different, more complex. She wasn't just sensing a struggling timepiece. She was witnessing the intersection of a master craftsman's accumulated wisdom with the inevitable limitations of human frailty. The tremor in Henrik's hands wasn't simply a medical condition. It was time itself moving too quickly for fingers that needed patience to complete their most important work. Without speaking, she moved closer to the workbench and placed her hands lightly on either side of the astronomical clock, not quite touching, but close enough to feel its mechanical longing. Then, with the same gentle attention she had learned to offer struggling timepieces, she extended that patient presence to include Henrik himself, understanding that the clock's silence was connected to the uncertainty in his hands, that both keeper and kept were struggling with the same temporal disruption. She began to create the kind of steady temporal space she had learned to offer, weaving the invisible four-beat rhythm around Henrik's workspace like a sanctuary made of unhurried time. Not controlling or forcing, but simply holding a gentle anchor that could serve as a foundation for both trembling hands and frozen clockwork. She felt Henrik's breathing settle into a deeper pattern, his shoulders releasing tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. "Better," he murmured, picking up his delicate tools with fingers that had rediscovered their natural steadiness. "You're creating moments where time itself becomes more cooperative, aren't you?" His hands moved with their familiar fluid grace, guided by 60 years of accumulated knowledge but supported by Iris's gift for making space, where delicate work could unfold without pressure. Together, they worked on the astronomical clock's intricate mechanism, Henrik's restored precision flowing through the temporal sanctuary Iris maintained around them. The tiny gears began to mesh properly, the balance wheel found its natural swing, and gradually the celestial faces began their slow, majestic dance across the star map. When the clock finally chimed, not the hour, but a melody that sounded like the patient unfolding of the universe itself, both craftsman and keeper exhaled with satisfaction. "There is something I must share with you," Henrik said during the quiet hour that followed, when the workshop held only the soft symphony of properly functioning timepieces. He moved to a corner cabinet secured with an old brass key, and from its velvet-lined interior, he lifted a collection of tools unlike any she had seen before. They were made of the finest steel, their handles worn smooth by decades of careful use, each one shaped for a specific aspect of the clockmaker's art. "My master's tools," he said softly, cradling them with the reverence of someone holding sacred objects, "given to me when my own hands were young and eager, passed down through generations of keepers who understood that tools don't belong to anyone permanently. They prefer to be in motion between people who use them with proper respect." He looked at his weathered fingers, then at Iris with eyes that held the depth of tide pools. "I think they have been waiting for you." As he placed the leather tool roll in her hands, Iris felt the weight of more than metal and leather. This was a passing of knowledge, a recognition that her gift extended beyond individual moments to encompass the larger rhythms that connected all things. She understood that Henrik was entrusting her not just with instruments, but with the responsibility of tending time's mechanisms with the same patient devotion he had brought to his life's work. "We don't own time." "Child," Henrik said, his voice carrying the accumulated wisdom of 60 years spent in service to temporal rhythms. We tend it. We listen to its heartbeat, and we help it remember its purpose. Sometimes that purpose is to hurry, to push us toward necessary action. But sometimes its most important purpose is to be still, to allow moments to unfold exactly as they need to, for exactly as long as they need to unfold. He paused, watching the astronomical clock mark the slow passage of celestial time, its movements now smooth and certain. You have learned this lesson more deeply than any apprentice I have ever known. You are a true keeper of moments, Iris. The world needs more of your kind. People who understand that the most profound repairs happen not through force, but through presence. That evening, as the lighthouse beam began its patient sweep across the darkening water and the cottage filled with the comfortable sounds of family settling into night, Iris arranged Henrik's tools on her small desk with the same careful attention she had learned to bring to everything precious. The astronomical clock Henrik had given her as a companion piece sat beside them, its celestial faces marking time with the unhurried dignity of stars crossing the vast night sky. She was learning that her gift encompassed not just individual moments of need, but the larger patterns that connected master to student, past to future, the accumulated wisdom of generations to the fresh understanding of youth. Henrik's trembling hands had been a reminder that even the most skilled keepers sometimes needed a gentle temporal sanctuary where their knowledge could flow freely, unimpeded by the body's increasing frailty. The lighthouse beam swept its bright arc across the water, and in its steady rhythm, she heard again the lesson that was becoming the foundation of everything she was learning to become, that the most important gifts are not the ones we keep, but the ones we tend with patient hands and understanding hearts, creating sanctuaries where others might complete the work they were meant to do in the world. And sometimes the greatest honor was not to inherit tools, but to become worthy of the trust they represented, a keeper not just of moments, but of the ancient wisdom that taught time itself how to be kind. The evening after Henrik had placed his master's tools in her hands, when Iris was still learning the weight of such trust, and the astronomical clock on her desk marked time with celestial patience, the phone rang with the particular urgency that cuts through ordinary moments like a lighthouse beam through fog. Elena answered, flour still dusting her hands from the evening bread, but her voice quickly shifted from casual greeting to the careful attention she reserved for emergencies that required immediate presence. It was Margaret, Finn's mother, calling from the hospital where she worked as a night nurse. Her voice carried the controlled composure of someone who understood medical realities but couldn't quite maintain professional distance when the patient was her own daughter. She came early, Margaret said, the words careful but weighted with worry. 6 weeks too soon. Luna's breathing on her own, but everything is so much work for her right now. Finn asked if Iris might come. He says she understands about time, about giving things space to unfold properly. The lighthouse would tend itself for the night. Samuel had trained the beacon's automated systems to function during emergencies, and within an hour, they were driving through the coastal darkness toward the regional hospital. The familiar landscape passed in shadowed glimpses, sleeping fishing villages, weathered piers, the patient rhythm of waves against invisible shores. Iris held Henrik's small wooden metronome in her jacket pocket, feeling its quiet potential like a held breath, understanding that her gift was about to be tested in ways she had never imagined. The hospital greeted them with the soft brightness of machines and polite voices, a place where time was measured in heartbeats and oxygen levels and the distance between alarm chimes. Finn met them in the hallway outside the neonatal intensive care unit, his hair pushed back by hands that hadn't known where else to go, his usual steady presence replaced by something that looked like a small bird caught against glass. His pockets made no sound. He had left his collected seconds at home and brought only the raw, bright urgency of now. She's so small, he said, and the words caught in his throat the way they had before he learned to trust the 4-beat rhythm. Iris felt her gift reach toward him automatically, creating the gentle temporal cushion that had become second nature between them. On the 4th beat, his breathing steadied slightly. Her name is Luna. It means light, but she's having trouble figuring out how to be here safely. Inside the NICU, the world transformed into a cathedral of quiet technology, where machines breathed with mechanical patience and monitors traced the vital signs of very small fighters working harder than anyone should have to work just to exist. Luna lay in an incubator that looked like a transparent cocoon, her tiny chest rising and falling with the determined rhythm of someone who had decided that breathing was worth the effort, even when it required every ounce of concentration she possessed. A doctor approached with the focused gentleness of someone who had learned the art of speaking hope, without promising what he couldn't guarantee. His badge read Chen, and when he looked up from Luna's chart, his eyes found Iris with a glimmer of old recognition, the way someone glances at a painting they've seen before but cannot quite place. "We'll watch her closely," he said to Margaret and Finn's father, who had driven down from the fishing grounds with salt spray still in his hair. "We'll take this hour by hour." Dr. Chen paused, his gaze returning to Iris with growing certainty. "We've met before," he said softly, as though speaking into a church. "You wouldn't remember. The night you were born, every clock in this hospital stopped for 13 seconds. His smile was the clean, small kind reserved for truths that have waited a long time to be acknowledged. It was a good night for impossible things. Perhaps tonight will be another. Iris felt a warm, quiet recognition move through her like tidewater in a rock pool. She understood that her gift had been recognized from its very beginning, that Dr. Chen had been waiting years to see what the child from that miraculous night might become. She moved closer to Luna's incubator, drawn by something deeper than curiosity, a sense of profound responsibility for this tiny life, struggling to find its rhythm in a world that felt too fast and too demanding. She settled into a chair beside the isolette and placed her palms gently on the warm surface, not trying to reach through the barrier, but simply offering the kind of temporal kindness she had learned to give struggling timepieces. Luna's breathing, which had been quick and shallow with the urgency of someone working too hard, began to settle into a deeper rhythm. Not slower exactly, but more confident, as if she had been given permission to take the time each breath required, rather than rushing. Anxiously toward the next one, Iris began to weave the invisible 4-beat rhythm around the incubator, creating what she had learned to think of as a temporal sanctuary, a gentle space where Luna's tiny lungs could find an extra fraction of a second to strengthen with each breath, where her delicate heart could beat with a fraction more certainty. She thought of Henrik's words about listening to heartbeats, about not imposing rhythm, but discovering the rhythm that wanted to emerge naturally. Hour after hour, Iris maintained her gentle vigil, working not just with Luna, but with the entire atmosphere of the NICU. She offered the same patient presence to Margaret, whose professional composure was struggling against maternal fear, to Finn's father, whose weathered hands kept reaching toward his daughter, before remembering the necessary distance the medical equipment required. When Finn joined her during the deepest part of the night, bringing coffee in paper cups and settling into the chair beside hers, she extended the temporal sanctuary to include him as well. "She's getting stronger," he whispered, his voice carrying wonder and gratitude, as they watched Luna's chest rise and fall with increasing steadiness. "It's like you're giving her time to figure out how to be here safely." The baby stirred slightly at the sound of her brother's voice, and for a moment her eyes opened, dark and alert and somehow ancient, as if she had been waiting for exactly this moment to announce that she was ready to stay. Through the long, drowsy hours of night, the NICU became a place where ordinary miracles did their work in small, persistent increments. The monitors registered subtle but consistent improvements, oxygen levels stabilizing, heart rate finding a steadier pattern, the tiny body learning to trust that breathing could be something other than constant struggle. Dr. Chen made his rounds with increasing satisfaction, noting changes that defied easy medical explanation, but spoke to the mysterious resilience of human life when given proper space to unfold. Near dawn, Luna found a stretch of steadiness that lasted longer than any before it. Her breathing settled into the patient rhythm of someone who had learned to trust her own small strength, and her color improved from the translucent pallor of premature birth to something that looked more like the healthy pink of a baby, ready to engage with the world. The nurse adjusted the ventilator settings with the satisfied precision of someone granting a small mercy earned. When Dr. Chen made his morning rounds, he stood with them a moment longer than protocol required. "She likes your quiet," he told Finn, then nodded toward Iris, "and she likes your timing." He made careful notes, the kind that never pretends certainty where none exists, and left them with a parting that felt like blessing. Step by step, breath by breath, we'll keep tending. Days passed in this gentle rhythm, with Iris returning each afternoon to maintain her temporal sanctuary around Luna's growing strength. She learned to work with the hospital's schedules, to respect the nurses' routines, to be a quiet anchor in a place of constant vigilance. Gradually, Luna's need for mechanical assistance decreased, her own lungs taking on more of the work, her tiny fists unclenching as her body learned to trust that the world could be a safe place to exist. The morning Luna was finally strong enough to leave the NICU, Finn appeared at Iris's side, carrying a small gift wrapped in soft cloth. Inside was a stone unlike any from his usual collection, perfectly round and white as a pearl, smooth as silk and warm with more than body heat. "She collected this one herself," he said, his voice steady with joy and gratitude. "During her first real sleep, when she wasn't working so hard to breathe. It's a brand new second, for a brand new start." As they prepared to take Luna home, Margaret embraced Iris with the fierce gratitude of someone whose worst fears had been gently held at bay. "The doctors say her recovery was remarkable," she said, tears mixing with exhaustion and relief. "They don't understand exactly why, but whatever kind of presence you offered her, whatever space you created for her to grow stronger, it made all the difference." That evening, as the lighthouse beam began its patient sweep across the darkening water, and the cottage filled with the comfortable sounds of family settling into ordinary time, Iris held Luna's white stone and Henrik's astronomical clock, understanding that her gift had expanded to encompass the most fundamental rhythm of all, the patient heartbeat that connects one moment to the next, the breathing that marks the space between hope and fulfillment, the gentle temporal sanctuary where new life could find its footing in an uncertain world. She had learned to be a keeper of more than moments. She was becoming a guardian of the spaces where life itself could unfold safely, where the most vulnerable among them could find the time they needed to grow strong enough for whatever the world might ask of them. The lighthouse beam swept its bright arc across the water, and in its steady rhythm, she heard again the lesson that was becoming the foundation of everything she was learning to become. That the most important gifts are not the ones we keep, but the ones we tend with gentle hands and patient hearts, creating sanctuaries where others might find the time they need to become everything they were meant to be. The weeks after Luna's homecoming had settled into the gentle rhythms of a village learning to breathe with relief, where the sound of a healthy baby's cries became as welcome as the lighthouse beam's steady sweep. But as autumn painted the coastal landscape in muted golds and the first frost touched the cottage gardens, Iris began to notice that Mrs. Holloway's evening walks had grown shorter, her steps more careful, as if she were negotiating with gravity rather than simply moving through the familiar path she had walked for decades. The music box still played its perfect waltz each night, but sometimes Iris would hear it stop mid-phrase, as if even mechanical memory had grown tired. When she mentioned this to Elena during one of their tide pool expeditions, her mother paused in her examination of a sea anemone and looked toward the cottage with lace curtains, with the expression of someone who had been hoping not to acknowledge what she was already seeing. "Some rhythms change naturally," Elena said softly, her hands still gentle around the delicate creature they were observing. "The kindest thing we can do is pay attention without trying to fix what isn't meant to be fixed." The words settled into Iris's understanding like seeds finding good soil, though she didn't yet comprehend their full meaning. On a Tuesday morning, when the air carried the salt-sweet scent of the last wild roses, Iris found Mrs. Holloway sitting in her garden chair with a leather journal open in her lap, her weathered fingers moving slowly across pages filled with careful handwriting. The older woman looked up with a smile that reached her eyes, but seemed to require more effort than it once had, and Iris felt that familiar stirring in her chest, not the urgent pull that came when moments needed temporal assistance, but something deeper and more complex. "Good morning, dear heart," Mrs. Holloway said, her voice carrying its familiar warmth, though it had grown softer, like fabric worn gentle by years of loving use. "I was hoping you might visit today. I've been writing letters, to my husband mostly, things I never got to say before he went ahead of me. But there's something I'd like to share with you, if you're willing to listen." The garden around them seemed to settle into deeper stillness, as Mrs. Holloway lifted a single sheet of paper from the journal. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady as she began to read. "My dear Iris, you came into my life when I had forgotten that some gifts are meant to be shared rather than simply remembered. You helped my music box remember how to breathe properly, but more than that, you reminded me that there is still magic in the world for those patient enough to tend it with love." As the words floated between them like music made visible, Iris felt time beginning to move differently, not slower exactly, but deeper, as if each sentence was being given extra space to settle into memory where it could be treasured forever. Mrs. Holloway spoke of the satisfaction that comes from a life spent in service to others, of the particular joy found in watching young people discover their own gifts, of the peace that arrives when someone realizes they have completed the work they came here to do. "I went to see Dr. Chen," Mrs. Holloway said, after folding the letter carefully. "The same one who was there the night you were born, when all the clocks stopped for 13 seconds. He says my heart is growing tired, that it will finish its work before spring comes again." She reached across the small space between their chairs and touched Iris's hand with fingers that felt like autumn leaves, fragile but still beautiful. "I know what you can do, dear heart." "I've always known. But I need you to promise me something important." The promise she asked for settled into Iris's chest beside all the other deep lessons she was collecting. "Don't try to make more of this than there is," Mrs. Holloway whispered. "Help me make what we have new true, not longer but deeper, not extended but complete." The words found their place in the growing collection of wisdom Iris was gathering, like Finn gathered his seconds, understanding that some gifts were too precious to be hoarded. The days that followed took on a quality of suspended time, as if the entire village had collectively agreed to move more gently around Mrs. Holloway's increasing frailty. Iris visited each afternoon, bringing honey cakes wrapped in soft cloth and Henrik's small wooden metronome, not to set a tempo for endings, but to create steady companionship when hours slipped and memory startled itself. They would sit together in comfortable silence, watching the light change across the cottage, walls and understanding that presence itself was the most profound gift either could offer. Sometimes Mrs. Holloway would wind the music box, and they would listen to its waltz together, the melody carrying memories of dancing in kitchens with crooked floors and love that had weathered decades of ordinary miracles. Other times she would share stories from her teaching days, her voice growing softer, but never losing the patient authority of someone who had spent a lifetime helping young minds discover their own possibilities. One evening, when the lighthouse beam was beginning its patient sweep across waters that reflected the first stars, Mrs. Holloway asked Iris to help her with something special. From a small wooden chest that looked as if it had been carved from the same walnut as her precious music box, she retrieved a collection of delicate clockwork mechanisms, tiny gears and springs and jeweled bearings that caught the lamplight like captured stars. "These belong to my grandmother," she said, placing the chest in Iris's hands with ceremonial gravity. She was a clockmaker's daughter in the old country, and these were her practice pieces. "I've kept them all these years, waiting for someone who would understand their true value." The weight of the gift was more than metal and wood. It was trust, recognition, and the passing of something precious from one keeper to another. During the final weeks, as Mrs. Holloway's strength ebbed with the patient inevitability of tide returning to sea, Iris learned the most difficult lesson her gift had yet to teach her. She discovered that sometimes the most loving thing was not to extend a moment, but to let it complete itself naturally. When someone was ready to make their final transition, when they had finished the work they came here to do, the kindest temporal gift was not more time, but deeper time, moments rich with presence and peace, free from the world's relentless hurry. The night Mrs. Holloway died, Iris sat beside her bed in the cottage that had become as familiar as her own home, holding the older woman's hand as her breathing grew softer and more spaced. She didn't try to slow time or create temporal sanctuaries. Instead, she offered the kind of patient presence that makes sacred passages easier to navigate, understanding that her role now was not to keep but to tend, not to hold but to honor. When the final breath came, it arrived with the gentle completion of a melody, reaching its natural conclusion. The music box on the mantelpiece played its waltz one last time without being wound, as if offering its own farewell to the woman who had tended it with such love. Then the cottage settled into a silence that felt not empty but full, complete with the satisfaction of a life well lived and a gift well shared. At the funeral, Finn read a poem Mrs. Holloway had written about the patience required to tend growing things, and his voice carried the steady clarity he had learned in the temporal sanctuaries Iris created. The entire village gathered to honor someone who had understood that the most important gifts are not the ones we keep, but the ones we pass along to those who will carry them forward into an uncertain but hopeful future. Henrik stood with his hat in his hands and later pressed a small card into Iris's palm, a sketch he had made years ago of a music box with a tiny lighthouse etched into its lid. "She once told me," he said quietly, "that a song does not end when it finishes. It goes on where we cannot hear it, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the silence that holds all music safely." That night, as the lighthouse beam swept its patient arc across waters that reflected a universe full of stars, Iris arranged Mrs. Holloway's clockwork treasures on her desk beside Henrik's tools and Luna's white stone. The music box sat among them, silent now but somehow not lonely, carrying forward the memory of someone who had understood that the most important moments can't be rushed, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is creating a space where endings can happen with dignity and grace. She was learning that her gift encompassed not just the creation of temporal sanctuaries, but the recognition of when those sanctuaries were no longer needed, when the most loving thing was to step back and let life complete its natural rhythms without interference. The lighthouse beam swept its bright arc across the water, and in its steady rhythm, she heard again the lesson that was becoming the foundation of everything she was learning to become, that the most important gifts are not the ones we keep, but the ones we tend with gentle hands and understanding hearts, so they can do what they were made to do in the world, even when that work includes the sacred art of letting go. The spring that followed Mrs. Holloway's gentle departure brought changes to the lighthouse community that felt both inevitable and surprising, like tide pools revealing new treasures after winter storms had rearranged the familiar coastline. Iris had grown taller during the quiet months, her understanding deepening alongside her physical presence, and when she looked across the village, she had always known. She began to see it through eyes that recognized the delicate temporal rhythms connecting every life to every other life. Finn returned from his first year studying marine biology at the coastal college with shoulders that had learned to carry confidence as easily as they once carried uncertainty. His pockets still made their soft music of collected stones, but when he looked at Iris across the familiar spaces they had shared since childhood, his eyes held the patient depth of someone who had been thinking carefully about the future and had arrived at some important conclusions. "I've been learning about hermit crabs," he said one afternoon as they walked the beach, where they had first counted seconds together. His voice carried the steady clarity he had discovered in her temporal sanctuaries, no longer needing the 4-beat rhythm to find his natural cadence. How they outgrow their shells and have to find new homes. There's a moment when they're completely vulnerable, between the safety they've known and the larger life they're ready to inhabit. The metaphor wasn't lost on either of them. Their friendship had followed reliable rhythms for years, but something new was stirring in the spaces between words, a recognition that they were approaching their own moment of beautiful vulnerability, ready to step from the familiar shell of childhood companionship into something larger and more generous. Henrik noticed the change first, the way craftsmen always recognize when familiar materials are ready for more complex work. "Young Finn has been visiting my workshop," he mentioned to Iris during one of their Saturday morning sessions, his eyes bright behind wire-rimmed spectacles, asking about the smallest mechanisms, the most delicate settings. He wants to understand how tiny jewels can bear the weight of constant motion without wearing away. The clockmaker's weathered hands moved over a balance wheel with practiced grace. "I think he's planning something that requires both precision and faith." The ring Henrik helped Finn create was unlike anything. In his usual collection, a band of white gold so fine it looked like captured moonlight, set with a stone the color of sea glass that had been tumbled smooth by countless tides. But hidden inside the band, where only the wearer could feel it, lay one of Henrik's rescued ruby bearings, a tiny star that would pulse gently against her finger, a secret heartbeat connecting her to the ancient art of keeping time. When Finn appeared at the lighthouse gate, on an evening when the weather forecast promised only the briefest sunset, before incoming clouds swallowed the light, Iris felt her gift stirring in recognition of a moment that deserved special attention. She could sense his nervous anticipation, the way his thoughts had been polished smooth by months of careful consideration. Like stones worn perfect by patient tides. "The meteorologist says we'll have maybe 5 minutes of good light," he said, but his smile suggested he wasn't particularly worried about meteorological predictions. "I was hoping you might help us make the most of whatever time we're given." The request was gentle but clear, not asking her to control nature, but to work with it in the way she had learned to work with all struggling rhythms. They climbed to the lighthouse gallery, where she had first learned to tend the beacon's patient sweep, surrounded by the vast conversation between sky and water. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the world in colors that seemed borrowed from a more generous universe, the predicted clouds began gathering with impatient haste. Without thinking about technique or method, Iris placed her palm against the lighthouse's warm stone and reached out with the same patient attention she had learned to offer struggling timepieces. She didn't try to stop the approaching weather, but offered it the kind of respectful conversation she had learned from her father's lighthouse wisdom. The clouds, given this courteous request, seemed willing to moderate their enthusiasm just enough to allow the sunset its natural dignity. In the golden light that lingered longer than physics should have allowed, Finn knelt with the reverence of someone offering his truest self. "I don't want to own time," he said, his voice steady as tide returning to shore. "I want to tend it with you. Will you marry me? Will you let us discover what kind of moments we can create together?" The yes that rose from her chest felt like the most natural thing in the world, inevitable as dawn after darkness. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, she felt the hidden ruby pulse once against her skin, Henrik's tiny star, a secret promise that some rhythms were meant to be shared. That evening, as the lighthouse beam began its patient sweep across waters that reflected the first stars, and Elena and Samuel appeared with champagne that had been waiting for exactly this moment, Iris understood that her gift had grown to encompass not just healing and protection, but the enhancement of life's most precious beginnings. She was learning to create temporal sanctuaries, not just for those in need, but for love itself, giving it the unhurried space it deserved to bloom into something strong enough to weather whatever storms might come. The lighthouse beam swept its bright arc across the water, and in its steady rhythm, she heard again the lesson that was becoming the foundation of everything she was learning to become, that the most important gifts are not the ones we keep, but the ones we tend with gentle hands and understanding hearts, creating sanctuaries where love can unfold at its own perfect pace, unhurried by the world's relentless clock. The months that followed Finn's proposal unfolded with the patient rhythm of seasons changing, each day bringing small revelations about how their shared life might bloom into something larger than either had imagined alone. The lighthouse cottage, which had always been a sanctuary for their small family, began to feel like a place that wanted to open its arms wider, to offer its particular gift of unhurried time to others who might need such refuge from the world's relentless pace. It began, as most important things do, with a single visitor who arrived unannounced on a grey morning when the fog hung thick enough to muffle even the gulls' cries. She was a woman perhaps Eleanor's age, her hair silver-streaked, and her hands carrying the fine tremor of someone whose nervous system had forgotten how to rest. She stood at the lighthouse gate, with the hesitant posture of someone who had driven a long way on the strength of a half-remembered story, not quite sure what she was seeking, but certain she needed something the ordinary world couldn't provide. "I heard," she said when Iris opened the cottage door, "that time moves differently here. That there's someone who understands when the world feels too fast." Her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had been running to keep up with life's demands for so long that she had forgotten what her natural pace might feel like. "My daughter said I should come. She said you might be able to help me remember how to breathe without counting." Iris felt that familiar stirring in her chest, the gentle pulling that had become as natural as the lighthouse beam's steady sweep. Without thinking about it, she created the kind of temporal cushion she had learned to offer, a space where the woman's anxiety could settle like sediment in still water. "Would you like some tea?" she asked, her voice carrying the unhurried warmth of someone who had all the time in the world. "The kettle's just finished, and the morning feels like it wants to be shared." Eleanor appeared with cups that had been warming by the stove, and Samuel emerged from his morning rounds, carrying the comfortable presence of someone who understood that the lighthouse had always been meant to serve whatever souls needed guidance. They sat around the kitchen table that had witnessed so many important conversations, and gradually, in the gentle temporal sanctuary Iris maintained around them, the woman's breathing began to slow, her hands finding stillness for the first time in months. Her name was Catherine, and she had been caring for her mother through a long illness, working full-time, and trying to maintain a household that felt like it was always one emergency away from chaos. "I haven't slept properly in 2 years," she said, her words finding their natural rhythm in the unhurried space between them. "Every time I close my eyes, my mind starts making lists of things that need to be done tomorrow, next week, next month. I've forgotten how to exist in just one moment at a time." She stayed for 3 days, sleeping in the small guest room that Elena had prepared with lavender sachets, and Mrs. Holloway's music box, playing its gentle waltz each evening. Iris didn't offer therapy or advice. She simply maintained the kind of patient presence that made space for Catherine's natural rhythms to reassert themselves. They walked the beach together, collecting smooth stones that felt good in worried palms. They sat in the lighthouse gallery, watching the horizon where sky met water in an endless conversation about patience and persistence. When Catherine left, she moved with the unhurried grace of someone who had remembered that breathing could be a pleasure rather than a chore. "Thank you," she said, pressing a small card into Iris's hand. "I'm going to tell my support group about this place, about what you do here. There are others who need to remember that time can be kind." Word spread quietly through networks of people who understood the value of what couldn't be easily quantified. Social workers who had clients needing more than conventional therapy could provide. Teachers who recognized students whose learning happened at different speeds. Healthcare workers who knew that some healing required time, measured in patience rather than protocols. They came seeking what they had heard whispered about, a place where time moved at the speed of healing, where the lighthouse keeper's daughter had learned to create temporal sanctuaries for souls battered by the key, world's impatience. Dr. Chen visited on a crisp afternoon when the autumn light painted everything in gold, bringing with him a quiet proposal that felt like recognition of something that had been waiting to be acknowledged. "What you're doing here," he said, watching Iris work with a young boy whose autism made ordinary time feel like a constant assault, "it has profound therapeutic value. The medical community is beginning to understand that some conditions respond better to temporal kindness than to pharmaceutical intervention." He spoke of establishing a formal partnership, of creating a retreat center that could serve as a complement to traditional medical care. "Not everyone needs more time," he explained, his words careful with the weight of professional responsibility, "but some people need time that moves differently. Time that doesn't pressure or demand, but simply holds space for healing to happen at its own pace." Samuel and Elena exchanged the kind of glance that passes between people who have been married long enough to hold entire conversations without words. They had both sensed this evolution coming, had watched their daughter's gift expand beyond individual moments to encompass something larger and more generous. The lighthouse, they understood, was meant to serve not just ships seeking safe harbor, but souls seeking refuge from time's relentless demands. Henrik arrived the following weekend with a leather satchel full of small timepieces, clocks that chimed softly, metronomes that breathed rather than clicked, mechanical music boxes that played lullabies at the perfect tempo for anxious hearts. "Every sanctuary needs its own rhythm," he said, his weathered hands steady as they arranged the instruments throughout the cottage. "These will help create the temporal atmosphere people need to remember their own natural pace." The transformation happened gradually, like tide pools revealing new treasures after gentle storms had rearranged the familiar coastline. The spare bedrooms became guest quarters, furnished with comfortable chairs and windows that framed the endless conversation between ocean and sky. The old service room became a library filled with books that invited slow reading, journals with blank pages, and pens that wrote like water flowing over smooth stones. Finn, watching this evolution with the patient joy of someone seeing a dream take physical form, began contributing his own understanding of natural rhythms. He created tide pool tours for guests who needed to learn patience from creatures that revealed their beauty only to those willing to wait and watch. He established a small workshop where people could learn to collect their own seconds, to find moments of stillness in the space between waves, to understand that some treasures could only be gathered by those who moved at the speed of attention rather than achievement. Luna, now 8 and carrying her own subtle sensitivity to temporal rhythms, became an unexpected teacher for the children who visited with their families. She showed them how to help butterflies rest on patient shoulders, how to listen to the different songs that shells made when the tide was coming in versus going out, how to find the quiet spaces where words could grow safely without being rushed into the world before they were ready. The lighthouse beam continued its patient sweep across the darkening water each evening, but now its light illuminated something more than navigational safety. It had become a beacon for temporal refugees, people who had been hurt by the world's impatience and needed to remember that there were places where time could be kind, where healing could happen at its own perfect pace, where the most important gifts were not the ones we keep, but the ones we tend with gentle hands and understanding hearts. As winter approached and the coastal light grew more precious, Iris stood in the lighthouse gallery surrounded by the soft symphony of Henrik's timepieces, feeling the weight and wonder of what they had created together. The lighthouse had evolved beyond its original purpose, without losing its essential nature. It remained a keeper of light. But now it also kept something equally precious, the understanding that some moments deserve to be held with extra care, that some souls need temporal sanctuary to remember their own natural rhythms, and that the most profound healing happens not when we rush toward wellness, but when we create gentle spaces where wellness can unfold at the speed of love. The lighthouse beam swept its bright arc across the water, and in its steady rhythm, she heard again the lesson that had become the foundation of everything she was learning to become, that the most important gifts are not the ones we keep, but the ones we tend with patient hands and understanding hearts, creating sanctuaries where others might find the time they need to become everything they were meant to be. And in the growing collection of grateful letters, smooth stones left as offerings, and the peaceful sleep of guests who had forgotten how to rest, she saw the lighthouse's true purpose finally revealed, not just to guide ships safely home, but to remind weary souls that there are harbors in this world where time itself can be a source of healing rather than pressure, where moments can be tended like gardens until they bloom into something beautiful and sustaining and eternally kind. The years that followed the lighthouse retreat's establishment brought a discovery that felt both inevitable and miraculous. Luna, now 15 and moving through the world with the unhurried grace of someone born already fluent in time's deeper languages, possessed her own remarkable gift for temporal healing. Unlike Iris, who had learned her abilities through experience and patient practice, Luna seemed to access her sensitivity through pure intuition, as if she had arrived in the world already understanding what others spent lifetimes learning to perceive. It began with the smallest, most vulnerable creatures. Iris would find Luna crouched in the cottage garden beside a chrysalis, her presence so still and patient that the butterfly inside seemed to sense the gentle temporal cushion she offered. Where others might watch with impatient anticipation, Luna simply existed with the emerging life, and the butterflies, given that unhurried space, would unfurl their wings with particular grace, their colors vibrant as if allowed an extra moment to deepen before taking flight. They just need time to remember how to be beautiful, Luna explained one afternoon, her voice soft as the rustle of wings, and Iris recognized the echo of her own childhood lessons in those words, the understanding that true beauty often requires an unhurried unfolding. The first human guest to experience Luna's gift was Marcus, an infant whose restless relationship with time made sleep feel like an enemy. His tiny fist stayed clenched against the world's overwhelming pace, his cries carrying the particular desperation of someone who couldn't find a rhythm that felt safe. Luna approached the struggling baby with intuitive understanding, settling cross-legged beside his carrier and beginning to hum, not a lullaby exactly, but something that sounded like the memory of waves against stone, a melody that seemed to emerge from the deeper rhythms connecting all living things. As her voice created gentle circles in the air around them, Iris witnessed something remarkable. Luna was creating her own temporal sanctuary, a space where the baby's frantic energy could settle like sediment in still water. Marcus's crying softened to whimpering, then to the quiet breathing of someone who had finally found a rhythm that felt like home. His tiny fists unclenched, and his eyes, which had been darting frantically around the room, found Luna's face and held there with the profound trust that passes between souls who recognize each other across mysterious distances. Word of Luna's gift spread through the quiet networks of families seeking help for children whose temporal sensitivities made ordinary life feel like constant assault. Emma arrived with dyslexia that made reading feel like trying to catch butterflies with words that wouldn't hold still. David's ADHD meant his thoughts moved too quickly for his mouth to follow. Sarah's selective mutism created silences that felt like cages rather than sanctuaries. Luna worked with each child with the patient instinct of someone who understood that every person's relationship with time was as unique as their fingerprints. She taught Emma to slow her reading by placing her finger on each word and breathing once before moving to the next, creating a gentle rhythm that allowed meaning to settle properly. She showed David how to collect his racing thoughts in imaginary pockets, the way Finn had taught her to collect seconds, giving his mind permission to pause between ideas. With Sarah, Luna's approach was different. She simply sat beside the silent girl and began to hum the same wave song she had offered Marcus, creating a temporal cushion where words could grow safely without being rushed into the world before they were ready. After 3 days of this patient companionship, Sarah whispered her first sentence in months. The quiet isn't scary when someone else is keeping it company. Dr. Chen, observing these developments during his monthly visits, nodded with the expression of someone recognizing a phenomenon he had been expecting. Evolution, he said simply, watching Luna help a young boy whose autism made ordinary time feel overwhelming. Each generation learns to navigate the world's challenges more intuitively than the last. You learn to work with time through experience and practice, Iris. Luna was born already knowing. The children she's helping now, some of them will grow up to teach their own children. And the gift will continue to evolve and spread. Henrik, now in his 80s, but still moving with the careful precision of someone who had spent a lifetime tending delicate mechanisms, began creating specialized tools for Luna's particular approach to temporal healing. Together, they crafted a collection of small music boxes that played different melodies at various tempos, some for calming racing thoughts, others for encouraging shy words to emerge, still others for helping restless bodies find their natural rhythms. She doesn't need to learn technique, Henrik observed, watching Luna adjust a tiny mechanism with hands that seemed to know exactly what they were doing. She needs tools that can keep up with her intuition. The music boxes he created for her were unlike anything in his previous work, instruments that responded to the user's emotional state, adjusting their tempo automatically to provide exactly the kind of temporal support each moment required. Luna's gift extended beyond human healing to encompass the natural world around the lighthouse. She would sit by the tide pools, not just watching but inviting the shy hermit crabs to emerge from their shells with less of their characteristic skittishness. Seedlings in the garden, given her gentle temporal presence, seemed to reach towards sunlight with particular vigor, their tender leaves unfurling with an almost perceptible sigh of relief, as if granted an extra moment to gather strength before facing the full demands of growth. Her most remarkable talent emerged with the migrating birds that used the coastal flyway each spring and autumn. Sometimes a bird, exhausted by its long journey or disoriented by unexpected winds, would fall to the ground near the lighthouse, its small heart beating with frantic urgency. Luna would crouch beside it, her hands hovering gently, creating a temporal sanctuary around the struggling creature. The bird's rapid breathing would slow, its frantic movements quieted, and in that unhurried space it seemed to gather its strength, its small body remembering the ancient wisdom of its kind. One autumn afternoon, as the coastal light painted everything in gold, Luna approached Iris with a request that felt both inevitable and surprising. "I want to learn the old ways too," she said, her voice carrying the quiet determination of someone who had made an important decision. "Henrik's techniques, your methods, the history of how people have always worked with time. I know I was born understanding some things, but I want to learn the rest." The conversation that followed stretched into evening, with Henrik joining them in the lighthouse gallery, surrounded by the soft symphony of properly functioning timepieces. Luna spoke of her growing understanding that her gift was part of a larger tradition, a lineage of keepers who had always known that time could be a source of healing rather than pressure. She wanted to learn not just to help others, but to train the next generation of temporal healers, children who were already being born with even greater sensitivity to the rhythms that connected all living things. "The world is changing," Luna said, her young voice carrying wisdom that seemed borrowed from someone much older. "People are being born who can feel time differently, who need different kinds of support than what the regular world can provide. Someone needs to teach them that their sensitivity isn't a problem to be fixed, but a gift to be developed." As the lighthouse beam swept its bright arc across the water that night, Iris understood that her role was evolving once again. She was no longer just a keeper of moments or a creator of temporal sanctuaries. She was becoming a teacher of teachers, a guardian of knowledge that needed to be passed forward to those who would carry it into an uncertain but hopeful future. Luna represented not just the next generation of temporal healers, but the beginning of something larger, a world where sensitivity to time's deeper rhythms would be recognized not as a disorder, but as a form of wisdom the world desperately needed. The lighthouse beam swept its patient arc across the darkening water, and in its steady rhythm, she heard again the lesson that had become the foundation of everything she was learning to become, that the most important gifts are not the ones we keep, but the ones we tend with gentle hands and understanding hearts, so they can be passed forward to those who will carry them into whatever tomorrow might bring. And in Luna's bright eyes and patient hands, she saw the future taking shape, a world where time itself could be a teacher, where healing could happen at the speed of love, and where every soul would have access to the temporal sanctuary. They needed to become everything they were meant to be. The morning Iris discovered silver threads woven through, her dark hair like moonlight caught in tide pools. She understood that time had been keeping its own patient account of all the moments she had tended, all the temporal sanctuaries she had created, all the souls she had helped find their natural rhythms in a world that had forgotten how to breathe properly. She sat in the lighthouse gallery, where she had first learned to tend the beacon's patient sweep, surrounded by Henrik's timepieces and Luna's music boxes, watching the horizon where sky met, water in their eternal conversation about patience and persistence. The retreat center had evolved beyond anything she had imagined in those early days when she was learning to offer temporal kindness to struggling moments. Dr. Chen arrived each spring now with researchers whose instruments had finally learned to measure what she had spent a lifetime tending by feel. "We are not trying to explain it away," he would say, leaning against the gallery rail with the satisfaction of someone whose life's work had found its proper recognition. "We're learning to honor it. Temporal processing sensitivity is being recognized as a neurological gift, not a disorder. What you've discovered here is changing how we understand human consciousness itself." Luna, now a woman with silver threading her own hair, had become something Iris had never imagined, a teacher of teachers, training a new generation of temporal healers whose gifts made her own early abilities seem like whispered conversations compared to symphonies. The children who came now were different from those early visitors seeking refuge from the world's impatience. These were souls born already knowing that time could be fluid, that moments could be stretched or deepened, that the mechanical ticking of clocks was just one small voice in time's vast chorus. Henrik, in his final years, had created tools unlike any in his previous collections, instruments that seemed to pulse with their own gentle rhythm, crafted specifically for working with the kind of temporal healing that was becoming humanity's next evolutionary step. When he passed one autumn morning, as naturally as leaves returning to earth, his clocks continued their faithful service, and his astronomical clock above the workshop door chimed not the hour but the rhythm of a peaceful heart, exactly as he had designed it to do. On a winter evening when the air tasted of snow that might or might not arrive, Iris climbed the familiar spiral stairs one final time, counting the 43 steps that had measured her journey from child to keeper to elder. The lantern room greeted her with its soft symphony of properly functioning timepieces, each one a rescued voice, now singing in perfect harmony. Finn found her there, bringing tea and honey cakes with the same unhurried devotion he had offered for decades, his presence still carrying the steady warmth that had first drawn her to him when they were children collecting seconds on the beach. "I was thinking," Iris said, her voice soft with years and wisdom, "about the night everything stopped for 13 seconds. It felt like time took a breath then, like it learned something it had been trying to remember." She looked out at the village lights where families were drawing curtains, where Luna's workshop still threw warm squares onto the frozen grass, where the tide pools waited patiently for morning to reveal their treasures once again. The request came not from her own desire, but from the accumulated gratitude of everyone who had ever found sanctuary in the lighthouse's temporal embrace. From the letters in the basket by the door, from Luna's students learning to teach others how to stop bracing against time's current, from Henrik's clocks and Mrs. Holloway's eternal waltz, from all the souls who had discovered that healing could happen at the speed of love rather than the pace of pressure. She stood within the circle of the great lens, palms resting lightly against the warm glass, and reached out with the same patient attention she had learned to offer struggling timepieces. But this time extending that temporal kindness beyond the lighthouse, beyond the village, beyond the familiar boundaries of her gift, not to control or pause the world, but to create one final, magnificent sanctuary where everyone who needed it could find an extra moment, a breath between heartbeats where forgiveness could arrive, where courage could bloom, where love could deepen just enough to sustain whatever came next. The lighthouse beam swept out as it always had, faithful to agreements made long before she was born. But now it carried something more, a gentle pause, barely perceptible, where time remembered how to be kind. Somewhere a father found the words he'd been trying to say to his daughter for months. Somewhere a surgeon's hands discovered the steadiness they needed. Somewhere a woman reaching for the phone discovered it wasn't too late after all to make an overdue call. As the gift completed itself and settled into the beam like a secret stitched into a hem, Iris felt herself becoming part of time's own rhythm, not disappearing, but expanding, becoming the stillness between heartbeats, the hush before dawn, the soft space where memories lived and futures quietly unfurled. She became the 13-second pause that would live forever in the lighthouse beam, a gentle presence woven into every moment that needed tending, every soul that required sanctuary from the world's impatient clock. The lighthouse beam continued its patient arc across the water, and in its steady rhythm there was still a gentle pause, just 13 seconds long, where time remembered how to breathe. And somewhere someone got exactly the moment they needed to heal. And in that beam that sweeps across the water each night, she's still out there, keeping watch over the moments that matter most, forever tending the spaces where time itself can be a source of healing rather than pressure, where love creates sanctuaries and souls remember their own perfect, unhurried pace. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.